Hello everybody, and welcome to day 5 of 28 days to master level chess tactics. In this video today, day 5, we're looking at double attack, and we're going to only look at one position. And we are also going to go over how to improve your general strategic understanding with more complicated tactics. So this is white to move, and now will be the time to pause the video, and I would suggest that you go from general to specific, evaluate the material, and then look for active forcing lines. With white to move, you would first notice that obviously the bishop is threatening the queen, but black is otherwise pretty passive. He has his rooks on the 8th and 7th rank, as well as the queen, and the bishops are a little passive. In order to improve your overall strategic understanding with these kind of tactical positions, what you would notice is the active placement of your pieces. For example, the rook on the 7th rank, the bishop covering the A1 to H8 diagonal, the knight on E5, the queen on D5, and also this rook on the semi-open F file ready to come into the game and make threats. So those kind of things can actually lead you to think about fantasy variations of how white increases activity, and then you could also look at the earlier game and notice how black played either passively or was defending for a while, and white just kept making threats. So in this position, white actually has multiple forcing variations. You could look at rook takes G7 check. Now the material is otherwise equal with white down a pawn, which it actually looks like he sacrificed the pawn for activity, but he does have this D6 pawn on the 6th rank ready to come in, and it also controls 2 squares on the 7th rank. But otherwise, now we're going to look at applying logic in chess. And what I mean by that is looking at potential moves of your opponent and eliminating possibilities. So let's look at how we would do that. Rook takes G7 check is something you should look at. And you can see from your strategic understanding that it actually starts giving away your active piece, namely the rook on A7 on black's 7th rank, and you actually bring black's dark square bishop into the game to oppose your own bishop. So that's already a problem. And now black is threatening your queen, so you'd have to move it, preferably taking a pawn. But if you look at these concrete lines, rook takes D6, we went from a completely winning position to a completely equal position. So the evaluation of this line would be that it's not very good. And you could see that it's not very good because black got suddenly active. He has this open D file, he has the bishop pair, and he's adequately defended. Now, of course, white could take on F4, and the material will be equal again, but the activity is where the evaluation of the position hinges on. Okay, so let's go back. So let's start again. Obviously, if the queen moves, then the rook could just take because the rook is hanging. So if the queen takes on E4, rook takes rook is losing for white. So you have to discount that you can't move the queen. I mean, you could take check, and actually you can't really move in anywhere because, well, I guess if the queen took, but even if you move here to C6, then the rook would just take anyway. So you have to do something more forcing. Now, when you see your pieces posted on very active positions, namely this bishop, this rook, and this knight, you don't really want to look for ways to move them, although this is where you go discounting moves. So the rook check doesn't work, the bishop is already active, the queen can't move, so that leads us to basically 1 or 2 pieces. I guess you could look at pawn forward. So you'd basically have 2 moves to look at: knight to G4. Actually, that opens up the bishop, and it threatens the bishop on H6, although it leaves the queen able to be captured. And then you'd look at something like maybe D7. Obviously, D7, and then the bishop can just take. So let's see, D7. Yeah, the bishop would just take, and then actually, white still has an advantage. It is an attacking move, but it's not as advantageous as the line we're going to look at. So these 2 logical moves is what's left after you discounted all the other moves. So let's look at knight to G4, which is the move made in the game. So knight to G4 is a perfect example of applying logic in chess, and because it opens up the bishop diagonal in coordination with the rook, and it also threatens the knight on H6. Now notice that the bishop cannot take on g4 because it's actually pinned ironically to the king, but you'd have to look first at bishop takes queen. You're giving away your queen. So with the double attack on all the different pieces and squares, knight takes check, and then it would be a mate in two, whatever the king does. So check, and then the pawn, notice, supporting on e7, allows the rook to come in and check. And if he went to the corner, then you would just get bishop takes g7 check. All right, so from knight to g4, you would have to look deeper into what forcing variations black can do. That would namely be rook takes a7. So let's look at that. So rook takes a7, and now you still get the check, and there's multiple checks, but obviously you want to capture the material. And then the knight and the bishop, well, I guess there's only one move. The knight's covering here, the bishop's covering here. And then logically, I guess the computer suggests queen to e5 so that you can get some kind of check over here. But actually, logically in the game, you take on f4. Notice the somewhat weak back rank of white as well. You also want to keep in factor your weak positional considerations, such as a weak back rank, and also the basic tactics that could happen because of that. Rook takes f4, the king has to go over, and now there's a few moves. The bishop's active, and luckily it's protecting a1, and the knight is active. The rook is pretty active. You could take on e4, but you'd see a more complicated defense. You'd notice something like rook to e7, which looks crazy, but again, basic tactics at play. The pawn can't take because then the rook would take, and if he still moves here, then the pawn still can't take. Well, I guess he could, but it just causes a lot more problems because the rook comes over. So in the game, white just kept the pin with queen to e5. Now he has time to move the queen out of the way. Now, I would say at this point, you could properly evaluate the position as winning for white because you have this advanced pawn, you have a lot of potential ways to win this bishop here, and you'd basically be up a knight and a bishop for a rook plus some pawns with a still raging attack against the king. In the game, we see queen to e5, and then we see rook to b7, just threatening to check here and get a quick mate. But white played a few more moves. We'll just see. So rook takes e4. He blocked with the bishop. And then he goes after that d6 pawn. And we see some more complicated tactics just trying to win that bishop and make some mate threats at this point. All right, so rook takes. And now the final move is knight to g8. A very beautiful move. And there's really no way to defend against knight to f6 check. The bishop is pinned. And if you see something like queen to d8, notice that white was threatening mate in 1. Then he would just bring in the knight, and then he would lose his queen. White would be up plenty of material. So there's no good way to defend against the knight to f6 check. White's pieces are too active, and he's either going to give away his queen or a ton of material. Notice he can't move back here because he would just take the bishop. He would just take the bishop, for example, like this. This was a very complicated position of double attack. I mostly focused on the earlier moves from the original position because I found it very, very interesting. And also, applying logic in chess is about discounting and reducing the amount of moves that you have to calculate. Because, you know, I mean, we're not computers. You can't mechanically calculate everything. That's why you have to apply an organized thought process. And actually, I was reading part of the book, the Move First, Think Later book, which has a lot of valid points about pattern recognition. But what I think that book gets wrong is, because he talks about you can't use a structured thought process. What I think he gets wrong is that you're not sitting there playing a game necessarily using a structured thought process, but what you want to do in your training is train your mind to be focused and disciplined in how you think about chess, which of course all chess masters and grandmasters end up doing. They have a very solid way to apply their knowledge. If they didn't, then they wouldn't be able to apply it. Yeah, of course, pattern recognition is the tip of the iceberg in finding the moves, but at a certain point when they're sitting there for 20, 30 minutes, an hour thinking about chess, they're not just running necessarily through patterns that they know, they're also trying to evaluate, calculate, and reduce moves that they have to look at. So I would say that this kind of course still has a lot of benefit, especially if you're not a grandmaster, which most people aren't. And so you really should focus on trying to reduce the amount of moves you look at by increasing your overall understanding. Thanks for following along, and I'll see you tomorrow to conclude in day 6, double attack. Don't fret if you got the solution wrong. There will be another time.